Don't forget to mute, gentlemen. I'm not going to do a global mute here. Hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, February 2nd, 2019. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today continues phase 2 with webinar number 6 in our series of webinars on the topic of comparing and contrasting the true teachings of Jesus with the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity. It is topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Its author and chairman of the committee is Neil Waldrop, for whom I am turning the facilitation of this webinar over to right now. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. We are, I believe, in the middle of an extremely interesting discussion, and I am confident that today's proceedings will introduce many insightful ideas and comments on the part of my fellow participants, all of you. If the viewers who are viewing this do not have Revelation Revealed at hand, then I recommend very strongly that they download it from the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor, www.globalendeavor.net. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. Global Endeavor is treated as a single word without any space or hyphenation in the middle. In addition, I recommend that if you are going to the website to download Revelation Revealed, that you also download a companion document called Romanita. Romanita is located on the website immediately above the link for Revelation Revealed. And this is because we will proceed to add that content, that information contained in Romanita as a tool for discussion at a later stage of our discussion today. So I recommend that you download that as well in order to be prepared. Now, since there is no facility that allows you to ask questions while you are watching, we offer you the option of sending us in a question or two, or whatever you wish, by means of an email message that you would send to the email address identified at the bottom of the homepage for the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Specifically, the email address is as follows: info@globalendeavor.net. If you desire to send us a question, we ask that it pertain to content of this discussion or something in one of the documents that we discussed today or previously. And we reserve the right to edit your questions and use them on the during some subsequent discussion at a time when the panel considers it appropriate to do that. But at this point, we're ready to begin. We are in the middle of page 95 of Revelation Revealed, which is, of course, part of topic 8, as Bob described it earlier. And specifically, the subheading that we're going to consider now is the subheading that reads Doctrines and Creeds in the middle of page 95. I will read that heading and the introductory sentence that follows the heading. D, Doctrines and Creeds. Jesus emphasized spiritual unity while repeatedly warning against creeds and traditions that would serve to guide and control believers. Marvin, if you are able to read the quotation from paper 141, I would invite you to do that in 2 paragraphs.
Okay. Can you hear me all okay?
Yes, you're loud and clear.
Paper 141, section 5, paragraphs 3 to 4. Your spirit unity implies 2 things, which always will be found to harmonize in the lives of individual believers. First, you are possessed with a common motive for life service. You all desire, above everything, to do the will of the Father in heaven. Second, you all have a common goal. Second, you all have a common goal of existence. So the first is a common motive for life service. Second, you all have a common goal of existence. You all propose to find the Father in heaven, thereby proving to the universe that you have become like him. Many times during the training of the 12, Jesus reverted to this theme. Repeatedly, he told them it was not his desire that those who believed in him should become dogmatized and standardized in accordance with the religious interpretations of even good men. Again and again, he warned his apostles against the formulation of creeds and the establishment of traditions as a means of guiding and controlling believers in the gospel of the kingdom.
I find these 2 paragraphs to be extremely interesting. Bob, why do you think Jesus warned them again and again?
It's a theme that we've talked about before, Neil. I'll just briefly bring this back, and that is it's the cyclosclerotic format that standardization, dogmatization, developing creeds delivers for the human psyche to be able to put a box around mental thinking, so to speak. Jesus had in that first paragraph that Marvin read, where he was talking about spirit unity. This is the real differentiation, I think, and the theme that I'm pointing to here is that this message that at least I've been discussing for the last couple of sessions, is Jesus is really driving home spirit unity, which was really part of this. He actually says in this particular paragraph, a common motive for life service and a common goal of existence. These are extremely high values, strategic values, universe values, cosmic values, and to drive that out or crowd that out with dogmatization, development of creeds, stifles the spirit development in an individual. So I think that first paragraph for me was quite poignant, and I hope that answered the question. Back to you, Neil.
Thank you. That's certainly a very interesting point of view. I will turn to Charles and slightly modify the question by asking whether the fact that Jesus repeated this injunction many times, saying it over and over again, in his view, Charles's, was because Jesus knew that his apostles would not follow this restriction.
Yes, it was outside their experience. They had never considered such a thing in any real sense. They had to unlearn as much as they had to learn, in a manner of speaking. And the idea of having common motives and goals, but allowing for the individuality of experience, is an advanced idea. And as intelligent and sincere as they were, that's a great challenge culturally for them. It was a great challenge.
Thank you. George, would you say that it is now our challenge, namely as readers of the Urantia book living approximately 2,000 years later, to put this into practice, as Jesus stated, to avoid dogmas and creeds, and to regret perhaps that the early Christians did not heed his warning? What would you say about that?
I guess I take a little bit of a different approach. I think I definitely agree that these two paragraphs describe a critical difference between a religious group of spirit unity and one of uniform beliefs, but I don't think they're necessarily opposite. In fact, I think they're intimately related. In paper 101, section 5, Melchizedek tells us there's a universe plan whereby evolutionary religion is periodically uplifted by revelation. It says, it is part of the plan of the universe that sooner or later, evolutionary religion is destined to receive the spiritual expansion of revelation. And so in the context of where we are today, we can look back and see the outworking of this plan in our own history. Because about 4,000 years ago, the third epical revelation was needed to uplift the evolutionary religion, which had been fostered by the Sethite priesthood originating in the second garden. The Salem religion, initiated by Melchizedek's revelation, eventually led to Judaism. Judaism reached its evolutionary limits at the time of Jesus, or perhaps slightly before. And Christianity is the response to the spiritual expansion of Judaism initiated by Jesus, who bestowed the fourth epical revelation. But Christianity has now reached its evolutionary limits. It's stalled. And the plan of the universe, as it's being implemented in Michael's local universe and on this world, calls for a new religion to emerge in response to the spiritual expansion of Christianity by the bestowal of the fifth epical revelation. In fact, in paper 195, section 10, the midwayers tell us this new religion is the hope for this world. It says, the great hope of Urantia lies in the possibility of a new revelation of Jesus with an new and enlarged presentation of his saving faith, which would spiritually unite in loving service the numerous families of his present day professed believers. And this hope is more than a possibility. The Midwayers tell us in paper 170, section 5, they engage in a prophetic forecast concerning Christianity's role in realizing the kingdom of heaven. To quote, the kingdom as Jesus conceived it has to a large extent failed on earth. For the time being, an outward church has taken its place. But you should comprehend that this church is only the larval stage of the thwarted spiritual kingdom. Thus does the so-called Christian church become the cocoon in which the kingdom of Jesus' concept now slumbers. So Christianity is the cocoon from which a new and higher religion will emerge in response to the fifth epical revelation. We've crossed over into the dispensation of a new planetary epic, something which has not occurred since the time of Jesus. This new religion is the next step in Michael's plan to spiritually uplift Urantia.
Okay, George, thank you. I would commend your selection of excerpts, but there is one intellectual or conceptual problem that I see in some of what you said. And it has to do with the various references that you made to Christianity, which individually seem to make sense, but they imply a static view of what Christianity is and what it will be and what the outcome is. In my opinion, we are in a dynamic phase, and Christianity has largely been the repository of many of these truths that were carried forward from what the apostles and others could remember and process about Jesus' teachings, but they certainly didn't process everything. And now what will happen, of course, is that the elements of Christianity that are positive and helpful will contribute to the future of humanity, and perhaps other elements will not be continued. In any case, Marvin, you have led the way by reading this document, reading these two paragraphs to us. And I would like to turn back to you in terms of what Jesus was doing when he warned his apostles about not creating doctrines and creeds, and whether that injunction in effect was one that he put forward in the knowledge that it would not be followed by them, and perhaps in the understanding that we and our successors and heirs over the next few generations and centuries will take it to heart. So you're free to comment on what I've just said, or you can proceed from anything that any of the others have said, if you wish.
Thank you, Neil. As I have often found myself in these conversations, I see it as sort of a dialectic conversation, and I appreciate your providing the context for it. And I find myself often providing the antithesis to your thesis. So once again, I'll probably do that. I'll make a couple of points. One is in the passages, those two paragraphs. Jesus is not saying, he did not warn them against the formulation of creeds and the establishment of traditions. I know that sounds radical, but if you read the whole sentence, and I'll read it again, what it says is, again and again, he warned his apostles against the formulation of creeds and the establishment of traditions as a means of guiding and controlling believers in the gospel of the kingdom. So it's not that he's saying, don't form traditions, don't form creedal statements. He's saying, don't use them as a means to control believers and a means of guiding them. You can use them as guide points, as indicators. You can use them softly. But the purpose of their teaching was to stimulate people in living spiritual experience, living relationship with God. And it's interesting to me in the first paragraph that the language he uses is quite psychological. He says, first, you are possessed with a common motive for life service. And then he talks to them about a common goal of existence. So these are psychologically functioning realities in people's lives, motivations and goals. They're not fixed and inert. So I think you can use statements, you can use formulations, traditions, etc., as long as they don't become codified and keep people from having the living experience. I'll just share a couple of other things, a couple of quotes that I shared with you, Neil, in some previous communication, some really good communication. This is from paper 170, section 5, paragraph 13, and some others. Jesus foresaw that a social organization or church would follow the progress of the true kingdom, and that is why he never opposed the apostles practicing the rite of John's baptism. The church, and this is 170, section 5:10, the church was an inevitable and useful social result of Jesus' life and teachings. So he foresaw it. It was inevitable and useful. The tragedy consisted in the fact that this social reaction to the teachings of the kingdom so fully displaced the spiritual concept of the real kingdom as Jesus taught and lived it. And then from paragraph 7, that same section, 170, section 5, the church as a social outgrowth of the kingdom would have been wholly natural and even desirable. The evil of the church was not its existence, but rather that it almost completely supplanted the Jesus concept of the kingdom. In this way, a formal and institutional church became the substitute for the individually spirit-led brotherhood of the kingdom. So the implication for me is that traditions, creedal formulations are simply tools, and when they become the be-all and end-all, and when they're used to control believers, living religion dies. But when they are used to really support and stimulate living spiritual experience, they're useful tools. And institutional forms of religion, organizational efforts, formulations of the gospel, we inevitably have to engage in those kinds of activities if we're going to be effective in any broad way to evolutionarily share the up-step religion of Jesus. We just have to be very sensitive to focus on living spiritual experience.
Marvin, I don't consider you an antithesis. I consider you a parallel. And I agree with much of what you have said. I do find that your interpretation of the final segment of the paragraph, of the second paragraph that you read, is interesting because you're emphasizing the final words of this as a means of guiding and controlling believers in the gospel of the kingdom. So if I pursue your thought, then at least it would be reasonable to conclude that from your perspective, the issue is not solely creeds and traditions, but the principle of authority and enforcement of uniformity that has frequently been attached to creeds and traditions, that authority imposes them and uniformity insists upon acceptance of these creeds and traditions. Am I correct?
Yes, in fact, the statement that most succinctly establishes that principle is 195, paragraph 10, and it's very brief, it's 2 sentences. And this brotherhood is destined to become and they italicize these words, a living organism, in contrast to an institutionalized social organization. And then they follow it with this qualifier: it may well utilize such social organizations, but it must not be supplanted by them. That's the key point, is institutions, traditions, rituals are simply tools. What end do we use them to? If we use them to control and guide believers unduly, we are making a huge mistake. If we use them to encourage and stimulate living spiritual experience and relationship with God and with other people, they're simply tools well used.
Well, I think we will have some nuances of difference here, even though I do consider you a brother in the spirit and entitled to your own views, which I believe are interesting and very expressive. Bob has just motioned his desire for a return to the discussion. Go ahead, Bob.
Yes, I'd like to follow up, or I'd like to segue off of something that George read, which was 170, paper 170, section 5, paragraph 21. And it's 2 words. This is a metaphorical picture that came back out to me, and I hadn't thought about it this way. The kingdom has failed. However, it's in the church is only in the larval stage. And then the other word was, thus does the so-called Christian church become the cocoon. Well, that's an interesting metaphor that I hadn't thought about, the real importance of this. And that is that there's a living organism inside of this boxed in, or I'm sorry, let me say it this way. This living organism is boxed in by the cocoon. And to me, this cocoon has to do something. It has to break away. It has to open up. And going back to a thought that I had last week was that I see this personal religion and the institutional part of it as eventually converging down to a hybrid. I think that connects to what you're saying, Marvin, is that these are tools. Is this cocoon a tool? Potentially. And I think that George, when you said that you can't have one without the other, I've sort of modified my stance since we've been discussing this, to be honest with you, in that we can't do away with that which is evolutionarily grown up for a couple of thousand years for sure. But I like the metaphor now, and I think I'm going to reflect upon that a little bit more. Over to you, Neil.
Thank you. Before I recognize George, I think I would like to do a little bit with the word cocoon in terms of its conventional meaning. The cocoon is the caterpillar encased in a certain membrane, whereby the caterpillar will turn into a butterfly. So the butterfly is not the caterpillar, and the cocoon is a temporary coating or covering that allows the emergence of the butterfly. Now, I don't know whether it is fruitful to pursue this, but I think the point of a cocoon is that it conceals an evolutionary development that does not result in the same thing that began the process. George, your turn.
Yeah, that was the whole point of what I had to say was that Christianity is not the religion of the future. It contains the gospel of Jesus in modified form, but nevertheless, it's the only religion which contains the gospel of Jesus. So it's the only religion with the potential to become something else, what I called and what I was talking about as a new religion. This new religion is not going to be Christianity any more than Christianity is Judaism. They're quite different. I mean, if you look at Judaism and Christianity, they're quite different. And this new religion, whatever it turns out to be, will be an evolution of Christianity that becomes a butterfly from the caterpillar. So that was my whole point. And this evolution will occur in response to the fifth epical revelation, just as Judaism responded to the fourth. So that was the point I was trying to make.
Thank you. Marvin has asked to speak, and I'm wondering if I should have butterflies when I recognize him. Here we go.
I like this conversation, and I think the metaphor has lots of implications. when the metamorphosis that's occurring in a chrysalis is done, and the butterfly breaks out of the cocoon and takes to the air, what happens to the cocoon? I mean, it's basically left as an empty shell. It's not a living reality. It's simply a container. I think that's the implication of what they're saying about this living organism and not being supplanted by any institution, any institutional form. The implication is that the living family of God, a set of relationships that is alive and thriving between human beings and God, is much larger than any possible human institution that might contain parts of it. Parts of it can aid in the development and evolution of this much larger and living spiritual phenomenon, and do so harmoniously, as long as those institutions recognize their partial nature as simply aids to the evolution of something much larger and living that transcends any human institution. And I think that, we will have institutional efforts growing out of this revelation that address the same kinds of goals that Christianity and other religions address. We'll have evolutionary forms. And I'm hopeful that they will not presume for themselves to be the be-all and end-all end goal, but simply means of accomplishing a much larger living spiritual reality than the institutions themselves.
Thank you. I believe that we all share these ideals and these goals of human development and spiritual development on our planet. We will see how the operations work out. And of course, I agree that the efforts of the revelators are intended to facilitate positive growth in the directions that all of us aspire to. Charles, I'm acutely aware that the rest of us have gone on and on and on and haven't given you a chance to speak in the last 5 or 7 minutes. I wonder if you would like to jump in on some aspect of what we have been saying or something else that occurs to you.
I will. Thank you, Neil. I agree with George, and I think his point is valid, well taken. However, notwithstanding the vitality of Christianity, according to people who take the census of religions on earth, Christianity constitutes approximately a third of humanity. That is to say, about a third of humanity identifies itself as Christian. And this resulted within 2,000 years. Actually, a good deal less time than that. So Christianity has proven itself historically to be very vital and very powerful in its dissemination. And I say that notwithstanding its liabilities, it's also very fractured. It has numerous isms, as we all know, and major divisions or splits in that history. What that means is not clear to me. I think, however, Christianity is not to be underestimated. I'm not implying that anybody did here in this panel, but it would be foolish to underestimate Christianity, given its vitality historically. But I think George is correct, or at least the premise of what I perceive as the premise of his points. A group, there's an expression in political science by Lord Acton, a political philosopher, that power corrupts. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the equivalent of this is any group that's well established, that forms an elite and an establishment, tends to want to bend the will of any individual to it. It has that tendency. Now, in these two paragraphs, the part that the master said that speaks to me mostly is, you're all purposed to find the Father in heaven, thereby proving to the universe that you have become like him. That to me is the single most powerful statement. And not only it implies we can find him, but we can be like him in certain attributes and so forth. This kind of thinking would run directly counter sooner or later to any group that's well established. So the liability of Christianity probably lies in its material success, even perhaps some of its spiritual and certainly some of its moral and social successes. I don't see how the dogmatizing and standardizing is compatible with finding the Father in heaven and becoming like him particularly. I do think, as Bob has said, there's a need for as I interpret what he said, there's a need for organization, yes. It's quite a stretch, though, to interpret that as dogmatizing and standardizing ideas, creeds, practices, and so forth, and then demanding that the individual adhere to those in one form of pressure or another. Hence, which I regard from a spiritual point of view in terms of the dignity of the individual judgment in spiritual matters that premised Jesus' whole import, requires that it's probably, and the reason he kept saying it over and over again, I think Marvin makes an interesting distinction, but I don't think he didn't want to see dogma carried too far and standardization of practices, rituals, and so forth carried too far. Because that inevitably, sooner or later, probably sooner than later, will interfere with finding God as an individual person and developing religion on a personal level first and foremost. I suppose it's too much to expect most human groups that have power, that evolve and acquire power, particularly many forms of material power, because we're so impressed by that, to go out of its way to liberating its individuals before God, and not to make sure that they adhere to the power of that particular group. So the commonality of motive and goal is indispensable to finding, in terms of in the context of a group, to finding God, because goals don't require, the pursuit of goals do not require uniformity. They do allow for unity, that is individuality of differences, different perceptions, and therefore different experiences. And the Christianity, although it's vitalistic, it's powerful. You don't get to acquire a third of humanity's identity because you don't have something. You have something. There's something in Christianity that's very, very great. That's wonderful. What will happen to it remains to be seen. Its spiritual core, however, I think, if Christianity, as it is organized and standardized and dogmatized, doesn't make adjustments to the personal level, then I think inevitably it has to yield to something spiritually superior, and it will. That's why I think the Urantia book comes in. Part 4 mainly will come into play when it's well known, when it's disseminated. It would be a tragedy, in my opinion, if Christianity can yield, do something that groups don't generally do or want to do. That is, while organizing itself administratively and so forth. At the same time, values the liberation of the individual spiritually. If it can do that, I don't know whether it can or not. I don't know whether it will or not. There are a lot of variables in such questions. But I think the potential probably still exists, given the way these points are worded in the Urantia book. There seems to be still room for real growth, real change. Well, the change will have to be transformative. And again, I don't think Jesus particularly is pleased with dogma and standardization. He organized. I mean, he had put Andrew in charge. The apostles were well organized. They're the very picture of organization. But we shouldn't necessarily compound or conflate organization with the dogmatic and the standardized.
Charles, thank you for these comments. I believe that we have a very interesting collection of ideas in front of us on the part of all people who have spoken. I believe further that we have largely done as much as we can to reach a common view, which is to say that there are certainly nuances of difference and nuances of different emphasis. We all certainly have expressed considerable support and attraction to the ideals of personal spiritual growth and development that Jesus expressed in the first paragraph of the segment that Marvin read. And then there are different opinions and interpretations of the second paragraph, highlighting certain words as opposed to other words and then elaborating from there. I think we're going to have to leave this and move along. Wherefore, I intend to read the final two paragraphs at the bottom of page 95, which in effect amount to my effort to summarize the previous quotation and its implications as I was writing the document in 2016. And then I'm also going to continue with a paragraph at the top of page 96, which introduces a different point, the point at which the efforts of the Apostle Paul caused Christianity as it was then developing, or the followers of Jesus, if you prefer, to diverge quite sharply from the Jewish tradition and to be separate. And then we can discuss that. In our discussion last week, there were reservations about the views of the Apostle Paul in relation to women in marriage. And I think there will be a different outlook on the Apostle Paul when we talk about the implications of the first paragraph on the top of page 96. In any case, here I go. I'm going to read 3 paragraphs in a row, starting toward the bottom of page 95. It is clear that Jesus was advocating complete religious freedom, the individual's right to reach spiritual conclusions and formulate religious beliefs based on his or her personal experience. In contrast, the techniques that Jesus warned against amounted to monolithic practices aimed at promoting uniformity, a pattern whereby the group exercises authority over the beliefs and actions of individuals. This, of course, is exactly what happened. We have no way of knowing whether the apostles were paying close attention to what Jesus said, but in any case, they did not pass along his warnings to their successors with sufficient energy and intensity. For example, the epistles attributed to the Apostle Paul make it obvious that he wanted all believers to adopt the same interpretation, his own. Now I turn the page to the top of page 96 and continue with the next paragraph. In addition to emphasizing his intense conviction that Jesus had redeemed humanity by dying on the cross for our sins, Paul argued most strenuously that converts to Christianity did not need to be circumcised or to adopt the dietary restrictions and other traditional practices that would have made them Jewish. This disagreement seems to have reached a climax in the late 40s or early 50s of our current era, at a time when Paul had journeyed to Jerusalem in order to confer with Peter and with James, the younger brother of Jesus. Now, this leads to a rather long footnote. Generally speaking, I do not favor reading footnotes when they are simply references, but in this case, the footnote is quite substantive and has important ideas that I think should be part of our discussion. And therefore, Bob, I wonder if you would be willing to read the footnote to us all the way from the beginning to the end. It includes 2 short quotations. Would you please do that?
Sure, Neil. Thank you. The footnote starts at the bottom of the page. The Midweyer Commission implicitly refers to this argument in paper 139, but the wording is general and does not identify the specific issues. There's a quote from paper 139, section 2, paragraph 7. Peter was the first of Jesus' apostles to come forward to defend the work of Philip among the Samaritans and Paul among the Gentiles. Yet later on at Antioch, he reversed himself when confronted by ridiculing Judaizers, temporarily withdrawing from the Gentiles, only to bring down upon his head the fearless denunciation of Paul. In contrast, the Midway Commission's subsequent analysis of what happened at Pentecost makes it much easier to understand the questions that Peter and Paul argued about. And this is from 194, section 3, paragraph 9. This day of Pentecost witnessed the great effort of the Spirit to liberate the religion of Jesus from its inherited Jewish fetters. Even after this demonstration of pouring out of the Spirit upon all flesh, the apostles at first endeavored to impose the requirements of Judaism upon their converts. Even Paul had trouble with his Jerusalem brethren because he refused to subject the Gentiles to these Jewish practices. No revealed religion can spread to all the world when it makes the serious mistake of becoming permeated with some national culture or associated with the established racial, social, or economic practices. Over.
Thank you, Bob. This is a profoundly important event in the story of the followers of Jesus. Historians who have looked upon the early years of the Christian movement, or the movement that subsequently became called Christian, I suppose, a better way of expressing the idea, started with the thought that at first it seemed to be a sect within Judaism, that the initial believers in the message of Jesus were people of the Jewish heritage and background. Paul, however, had a very different view. Paul went to the Gentiles, and he ultimately concluded that it was not productive, indeed counterproductive, to require believers in the teachings that he was passing along to become Jewish, that this was new material, that he was preaching, in effect, a new gospel from his own viewpoint. And therefore, that people who were interested in what he had to say did not need to become Jewish. And this, of course, facilitated his work among the Gentiles, among non-Jewish people who might have been roughly Roman, or at least Greek-speaking people subject to the authority of the Roman Empire. So I would like to turn to the underlying issue here, and that is the relationship between revealed truth, spiritual leadings, and particular customs or traditions that are closely associated with a specific group. Now, we remember, of course, that Jesus was a Jew, that the tradition of Judaism had descended partly from teachings by Melchizedek, that the persons who supervised the fourth epical revelation, namely the birth of Christ Michael of Lebanon in the human form of Jesus of Nazareth, chose the location in Palestine that had a Jewish background because at that time it portrayed a clear view of the Father of a single God in heaven, whereas that was incomparably better than anything else available. But now we reach the point at which the traditions of that particular group of human beings were not compatible with the idea of an epical revelation spreading to the world at large. And so the conflict between the teachings of Paul and the traditions of Judaism effectively became inevitable. Marvin, I see you at least rubbing your head here, and I would offer you the opportunity to advance a complementary view, or for that matter, an opposite view, if that turns out to be what you have in mind.
It's like rubbing the magic bottle, hoping that you pops.
I did not see any gas emerging from the top of your skull, sir.
There's an interesting passage, and if I had the time, I'd find it. It's, to me, one of the most interesting passages about the early evolution of Christianity. And I'm going to poorly paraphrase it. They say that Paul, in his compromises with evolutionary religion, created a situation that resulted in the rapid and effective early spread of Christianity. At the same time, and this is my paraphrase, creating a ceiling for its development in terms of global spread, because he associated it with elements in Western culture, elements in Judaism, for instance, the whole sacrificial system. I think that's the primary point they're making. And I think that's the principle here. You can make a compromise with the surrounding culture in evolutionarily attempting to spread new revelation. If you make that compromise, you may be more effective in the short term, but in the long term, you're really curtailing your much longer term and larger result. And I think that's very true with the atonement doctrine, the sacrificial doctrine, which Paul appended to Jesus' gospel. It was a direct transplant from the Jewish sacrificial system and the sacrificial systems of most of the evolutionary traditions of the time. And he did it, and it accomplished a rapid spread. It makes sense to certain elements in human nature psychologically, but it's a poor solution. And as a result, it's really limited the spread of Christianity. And I think that's an important lesson for us. We need to be able to move more slowly, but with much larger long-term goals, which is the spiritual uplift of all of humanity, and not burden our spiritual message with this revelation, with the trappings of any particular culture. That's, to me, the key implication. We have to do it evolutionarily within a cultural context and do it artistically, effectively, but we have to very carefully watch the compromises we make theologically, and really make very few of them. I think the gospel, in terms of a way of living in spiritual family that the Urantia book presents us, the true gospel of Jesus, can be very effectively presented evolutionarily without making those kinds of sacrificial compromises.
Thank you. I have listened to you very intently, and I commend the general direction of your thought, as is almost always the case, frankly. But I did not hear a specific affirmation that the key point that Paul and Peter and others were arguing about leads to your verdict that Paul was correct in that regard, that followers of the teachings of Jesus as interpreted by Paul did not need to be required to be circumcised and to observe the dietary restrictions that were traditional in the Hebrew faith. But I assume that you agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, that allowed him to reach out to Gentile populations. So yes, it was a compromise, and that was an effective one, I think.
Thank you, Marvin. George, it's your turn now. I would like you to have complete freedom to comment on the nature of the argument or upon what it led to, however you wish.
Okay. I found my previous research, I found a quote, citation in the book in paper 121, section 5, which refers specifically to what Marvin referred to. It says, Paul, in an effort to utilize the widespread adherence to the better types of the mystery religions, made certain adaptations of the teachings of Jesus so as to render them more acceptable to a larger number of prospective converts. And there's a similar sort of citation in paper 166, section 5, where Paul remade the teachings of Jesus so as to present less that was objectionable, first to the Jews, then to the Greco-Roman believers in the mysteries. So I think that may have been at least one of the quotes you were looking for, Marvin. In terms of, I've lost my train of thought. Hang on.
The underlying question has to do with universal application to all human beings as opposed to particularly catering to or identifying with a sub-element of one kind or another.
Yeah, I see a couple of problems. One issue I haven't been able to resolve in my own thinking is a truly universal religion would lead to spiritual unity. But how can we get to spiritual unity without the gospel of Jesus? There seems to be, it seems you can't get there without beginning with the gospel of Jesus. You can't just one day wake up and say, oh, I read the fifth epical revelation and I'm going to create a new religion. It just doesn't work that way. Things have to evolve from where we are. And the only religion that can evolve in the direction which the fifth epical revelation wants to lead us is Christianity. It won't be Christianity that turns out to be the worldwide influence, but Christianity will be the origin of the religion that does. So I'm a little bit, I agree with the essential premise of everything we're doing here, but I don't see how we can get to a universal religion of spiritual unity which unifies the world without beginning with Christianity and working our way forward, evolving our way forward. There just is no, I don't see a way. Perhaps someone else sees a way to get there without relying on Jesus and his gospel, but I don't see a way.
George, I'm once again forced into the situation of talking about your vocabulary and the ideas and how they relate to your ideas. It seems to me that we start with the idea of the teachings of Jesus as opposed to the doctrines and traditions of the organized institutional church that is called.
Yeah, I was talking about the gospel of Jesus as it's presented in the Urantia book.
Okay. The underlying problem of the vocabulary is that there is a great deal in Christianity that is not according to the true teachings of Jesus. And the example that we've been discussing that Marvin talked about and that you mentioned too about the doctrine of atonement and sacrifice is not the true teaching of Jesus, but it is deeply embedded in Christianity. So we have an evolutionary process of how to promulgate, how to effectively act upon the true teachings of Jesus on the understanding that Christianity contains some of the true teachings of Jesus intermixed with other material that he did not teach. And so there we are. To predict that Christianity is the vehicle that will eventually mutate into the true teachings of Jesus as applicable to all the world is one possibility, but I believe that there are other possibilities, and I certainly cannot predict how things will work out. But the problem that we have in this context is that in addition to some of the true teachings of Jesus, the Christian faith as it exists today includes quite a bit that Jesus did not teach. Now, before I recognize you, Marvin, I think I am obliged to give Charles his first opportunity since you, Marvin, have spoken once on this subject. Charles?
Well, part of the challenge is that the kingdom of God, as Jesus understood it and taught it, is not of this world. On the other hand, we live in this world. It requires a different and relatively new frame of reference. I would start by, this is what I do when I talk to people about the religion of Jesus. First of all, I refer to it as the religion of Jesus. I prefer that phrase in the gospel of Jesus. The gospel is included in that. The religion of Jesus also includes how he lived, how he felt, what he thought. In any case, the religion of Jesus is spiritual and not material. When most people, I think, historically and in the present day, think about religion, they do it in many ways, in moral, social, and material ways, or a moral, social, and material frame of reference. Jesus said something to Thomas that strikes me as perfect insight. That someday the kingdom of God will be understood as the family, in a family sense, and it's using the family model more than the kingdom model. It is a kingdom, but it's really a family. We know that the father idea is still the greatest idea we'll ever have of God, and a father is a parent. The rationalization for calling ourselves brothers and sisters to each other stems from being children of that father, being children of God. And I think that's the direction. I think my confounded phone is running low. That's the direction, I'll get another phone, that we have to go in. Christianity, as we were talking about earlier, will have to undergo some form of transformation. I believe it'll have to be along spiritual lines. There may be applications to morality and sociology and so forth, but let's remember that the religion or the gospel of Jesus is essentially about a kingdom that's designed for all eternity, that's to be occupied eternally, that is spiritual, whatever that means. And the material view of religion will have to be, I think, is destined to some extent be downplayed by its own very nature. It really cannot speak to the soul the way the spiritual dimension of the religion of Jesus can. And the question of Christianity is another question, but it's in a sense secondary to what the Urantia book presents, which is directly the revealing the actual religion of Jesus, including his gospel. And you see it in 20th century history. The great questions of the 20th century were unable to be adequately addressed in philosophy and science, hardly even in religion, at least the material aspects of religion. The future of humanity will be along spiritual lines first and foremost, and everything else will follow, is how I view it. And the religion of Jesus, vitality, the vitality of the religion of Jesus lies in the spiritual temple, the temple of spiritual brotherhood, one of the ways he described
it. Thank you, Charles. I would say to Bob that if you are patient for your first turn, you will allow me to recognize Marvin for his second turn on the basis that Marvin having a second turn actually will give you a larger target to shoot at.
Actually, go ahead, please, with Bob.
Marvin, I've just given you a perfect opportunity to speak, and I could see Bob nodding when I asked the question. So go ahead, please.
Okay. I'll just sort of speak plainly. I think as the mission, the work of the fifth epical revelation, the Urantia book, proceeds over the next several centuries, my guess is what we will see is some subset of Christians who are looking for some larger vision, who identify as Christians, will come to embrace the book and establish their own evolutionary and organized efforts. and they may call it something other than a Christian, or they may use the term Christian, but it will be rejected by the large majority of Christianity simply because the atonement doctrine is so embedded in Christian theology. It's going to see it as blasphemous. So I think it'll establish offshoots that claim Christian status, but will not be accepted. And what eventually happens with that will be interesting to see evolutionarily. I think in addition to that whole phenomenon, there will be those among us as readers of the Urantia book who will attempt to form organized religious movements, spiritual movements, with the simple gospel of Jesus. And I agree with you entirely, Charles. I'm involved in such efforts, that it will be focused much more on spiritual family, the family of God, as a potent metaphor for the spiritual life, that all of us have parent-child relationship with God and can develop that, and have sister-brother relationship with each other and can serve each other in that larger living set of relationships. And I think we'll be making attempts to institutionalize, organize efforts to do spiritual outreach using that model, and not identify with Christianity at all. And do that quite intentionally in order to be able to appeal to a much larger, like Paul did, but with a different MO, to appeal to a much larger group of people than Christians, to appeal to living religionists in every tradition, and the many, many people these days who don't identify primarily with an institution, but call themselves spiritual seekers, but are not interested in affiliation with an institution. I think we are called to the adventure of developing organized efforts to reach out with the gospel in ways that are only semi-institutional, that have institutional elements because you need them in order to accomplish anything in group effort, but that are institutionally light and much more gospel-centered and much more living a way of life in the family of God centered. And if we're successful, we'll develop what Jesus termed that new and different kind of religion that Christianity never did manage to become. So I think the challenge remains out there for us, and I think we'll address it, and I don't think it'll be called Christian. I think it'll develop different ways of self-appellation and spread and being known, but with the central metaphor of the family of God rather than the kingdom. So I'm very much in agreement with you there, Charles.
Before I yield to you, I cannot resist the opportunity to follow Marvin's comments by saying that in many regards they parallel the instructions that Emmanuel gave to Michael before he left Salvington, that his teachings and his life are to be the common heritage of all religions and all peoples. And we're going to have to work to get there, but at least the vision that you, Marvin, have given us is an interesting path in that direction. And I will simply stop there. Bob, after all these opportunities that I have not given you, I really need to give you a true opportunity now. Your turn.
Thank you, Neil. Wow, what a topic. It's also a conundrum, I think, for the Fifth Epochal Revelation students. George asked posed a very interesting premise that I'd like to get to. But before I do that, let me think. I had a picture of the Master Seraphim, project promoters, mind focalizers, and ideational clearinghouses. That's essentially how we know that they operate. I can just see them, waiting for this idea, this ideal to show up with some kind of an idea behind it. They're going to just, turn up the voltage, and we'll all move out of our cocoon. So that's my first thought. My second thought, as we were talking about this, was the juxtaposition between a neighboring planet and where we are today. I'm sorry, where Christianity has come today. I see them at both extremes. The neighboring planet, kind of an isolated continent, not as diverse, doesn't have to deal with as much pluralism as we need to. And they don't have any priests. They don't have any institutions other than the family institution, I think Charles brought that up first. The in paper 98, there's a very yes, in paper 98, there's a very interesting list of what came into Christianity. I just want to run through this quick because we're talking a little bit about the history of this. The Melchizedek teachings, the Hebraic system of morality, ethics, and theology, the Zoroastrian concept of the struggle between cosmic good and evil, the mystery cults, especially Mithraism, the historic fact of the human life of Joshua ben Joseph, the personal viewpoint of Paul of Tarsus, and the philosophic thought of the Hellenistic peoples from Alexandria to Antioch, through Greece to Syracuse to Rome. This is so juxtaposed to the neighboring planet that might be, and I've come to the speculation that might be why that paper's there, is to show the juxtaposition and say, you have a different set of issues that you have to deal with here on Urantia. As you get through the fifth epochal revelation, you really need to understand the origin and history before we can even begin to speculate on the destiny of, where this, where the cosmic picture that the fifth epochal revelation provides us. So go back to one more thing about Christianity, and that is there was a statement in paper 195, the fourth from the last paragraph in the entire book. Christianity contains enough of Jesus' teaching to immortalize it. I was thinking about that, George, as you brought up, the premise and the question. Well, how do you get to wherever we're supposed to go without starting from Christianity? The picture of the larva and the cocoon sitting in the chrysalis. I get that picture right. Has to break open and allow us to be able to not make the compromises that Marvin, you had brought up. I thought that was, I hadn't thought about that, but when you brought up the fact that Paul had to make so many compromises, actually all of the early messengers had to make a bunch of compromises because of that list that I just read. I mean, we're talking about multiple streams to cross, multiple streams to bring into a watershed. And maybe we're seeing the watershed here, now at this 21st century. Every compromise is a short-term solution. We all know that just from how our democracy works. Long-term solutions have to have different kinds of aspects, different kinds of mechanisms to be able to get to long-term, but compromising is a problem. So how do we not compromise the fifth epochal revelation as had to happen to get to where Christianity, that was comatose for 1,000 years, began to open up somewhere around the Crusades time, I suppose. So that's my thought for all of that. I kind of wandered around a little bit with a lot of the discussion. I hope I came to the question that you were asking, Neil. Sometimes when you get to, talking about these things, you forget the question. Over.
I am not really sure what I should say about that, other than the fact that, yes, that does happen. And I will recognize you, Marvin, in just a minute. I want to take the opportunity by some of Bob's remarks about the Master Seraphim to state quite explicitly that the Master Seraphim have not signed on as a sponsor of this panel discussion. I will have to say that we did not ask for that either, but it would have been ludicrous to try. On the other hand, I believe that this spirit of our discussion is fully in keeping with the efforts that they, the Master Seraphim, are seeking to promote, the positive development of more tolerant, broader, and more genuinely spiritual ideals among the peoples of Urantia as one of their goals. Not the only one, certainly, but certainly among them. All right, Marvin, you have now told me by a chat message that you have found one of the paragraphs that you were referring to before. I thought George did a fairly good job of identifying some of the elements that you implied, but now please go ahead and read the passage that you really had in mind.
Well, I'll simply say, in relation to your last point, I think the angels love it when we can work to distill the wisdom of this revelation to aid our evolutionary efforts. So I consider this an endeavor in support of that goal. So I think they're celebrating it. George, you did a great job and found some, but I found the passage I was looking for, which is very related to the ones you read, which I think is the guiding passage to really the theme that you were expressing, Bob, about this issue of compromise, theologic compromise. And it's 149.2.1. It's a stellar piece of communication. Jesus understood the minds of men. He knew what was in the heart of man, and had his teachings been left as he presented them, the only commentary being the inspired interpretation afforded by his earth life, all nations and all religions of the world would speedily have embraced the gospel of the kingdom. The well-meant efforts of Jesus' early followers to restate his teachings so as to make them the more acceptable to certain nations, races, and religions only resulted in making such teachings the less acceptable to all other nations, races, and religions. That to me is the guiding comment. You know, in whatever compromises we make as we evolutionarily attempt to reach out with these teachings to uplift our culture, we have to really stay with the central teachings of Jesus and not compromise any one of them, or not add anything that were not part of his central teachings. So that's a pretty clear set of guidelines, I feel.
Thank you, Marvin. Yes, I will recognize you in just a second, Charles. I think in addition to what you've just said, the lesson of our earlier discussion is that we, or whoever is pursuing these ideas, must steer way away from authority to impose or seek to impose beliefs on anyone or doctrines. That is, in effect, antithetical to the very inspiring agenda that you've done your best to describe, Marvin. Charles, your turn.
I wholeheartedly agree with Marvin. I think what I mean is the point that he's emphasizing in regard to not adding different subcultural notions or notions from different subcultures or cultures in general to Revelation. The problem that we're talking about is much more complex than I think has heretofore been mentioned. However, the Urantia book, the fifth epoch of Revelation, involves aspects that are scientific, dimensions that are scientific, philosophical, historical, as well as religious and spiritual. So a discussion of the gospel of Jesus or the religion of Jesus has a very big context. It's not just the religion of Jesus, it is the bestowal of Michael of Nebadon. That's part of the revelation. It's a big part of the revelation. It's his willingness to go through 6 other bestowals. There's a tremendous context set by the fifth epochal revelation that the religion of Jesus is a part of. Now, the words of Jesus are eternal, I believe. They are all things and beings consist in them. And around page 1409, 1410 is a list of various titles of him that he accepted, and that's included. He is the captain of our salvation. That's also included in that statement, that list. But the fifth epochal revelation extends all the way to paradise. So our challenge or task or labor of love, as I think of it mainly, study and service is a labor of love, and it's a privilege and an opportunity and a blessing, is phenomenal. I believe it to be all doable. but it's phenomenal because it does involve facts, meanings, and values, science, philosophy, religion, and history. It involves origin, history, and destiny, which is the definition of spiritual wisdom according to a divine counselor. And that is the framework, the context that we are operating within. That's what we've been given, this enormous jewel that will never decay. To borrow a 19th century educational phrase, education is a jewel, not decay. But Marvin's point, to come back to that, is well taken. There's an expression in baseball, which is keep your eye on the ball. In our case, it's everything between the forward and page 2097. That's the ball we must keep our eye on. No wonder it'll take over 1,000 years to develop this. And in the process, to make it, to allude to even a deeper and greater, broader complexity, we have to marry. In doing this, we'll have to learn how to marry revelation and evolution in a way that's intelligent, wise, factually accurate, meaningful, and of real and lasting value. Again, I believe it all to be doable. But in talking about the gospel of Jesus or the religion of Jesus in the context of the fifth epochal revelation, we're not just talking about part 4. That's an extraordinary aspect, it's an extraordinary dimension to it, but there are other dimensions. It's not without instruction that the first 5 papers are about introduce the nature and attributes of the universal Father. And the most common attribute is love. It's not righteousness. It's not justice. It's not beauty. It's love. It's not truth. It's love. And I actually counted them all up, all 5 papers. And love is mentioned more times than the next 2 ones that are mentioned, 2 and 3, together. The second and third ones. Love is mentioned more than those 2 combined. And that, I think, describes this blessing, this privilege that we have. And my best intuitive sense as a veteran teacher, and had a lot of experience in teaching, very rich experience, by the way, very multifaceted in many different types of audiences and groups, essentially all the races, all the classes, lower, middle, and upper, and so forth and so on. My intuitive sense, based on that, for what it's worth, is that we will very likely succeed. And unless I missed the mark completely, I agree with Marvin with regard to the Master Seraphim in this panel. But I would remind everybody of the significance of work importance over self-importance. As far as bullying people, that's what it amounts to, Neil. As far as bullying people intellectually or morally or philosophically or any other way, in terms of ideas and practices and so forth, we should treat that as forbidden. We should always do what Jesus did, put the individual in front of us first, and the individual dignity of liberty in spiritual matters. In some ways, this discussion is similar to the history of modern democracy. The United States still continues. Many countries, democracies, have gone through a number of constitutions. We have not. And the reason is we've kept our eye on the ball. The ball for Americans would be liberty, human liberty. That's why it's the Statue of Liberty. Now, all this is not coincidental. It grew as part of our growth experience. It evolved. But it was inspired. And we've been given 2,097 pages of inspiration and knowledge and skills and insights and foresights. And it is astounding and uplifting, and that's our ball. It's the entire book is our ball. and we must keep our eye on it. We must remember, we don't know the consequence. One last, in closing, I'll make this point. I'll emphasize this point. I've done it before. I think it merits being repeated. We don't know the real consequences of what we think and say and do we? But God knows. And remember, in the First Mansion world, they teach the actions are ours. That is our responsibility. We're not just here flotsam and jetsam. We do have a responsibility to act, but the consequences are God's. That includes Michael of Nebadon. It's enough to take one's breath away.
Charles, I certainly will agree that much of what you have said takes my breath away. But I would particularly want to comment on one phrase that you used because, in effect, I consider that almost the magic word in the context of television quiz shows from the last 1/3 of the 20th century. And the two words that I have particularly in mind are your words, 1,000 years. And to me, that helps understand that the horizon is not our lifetimes or even the lifetimes of our children, but the next 1,000 years of evolutionary growth on our planet, in which we can hope to achieve the synthesis and the unification of these many different elements in the fifth epochal revelation. Now, I realize that Marvin has asked for the floor yet again, but he's already spoken thrice under this heading, which is one more than anybody else. And I must take my responsibilities as the moderator seriously enough that I cause our discussion to move along. Now, before I do that, I will comment that every week I am obliged to write a summary of our discussion. And I will have a tremendous time trying to figure out how to write a summary of this discussion, I assure you, gentlemen. So that does not deter you from coming up with profound remarks. But I do ask you to be patient when my summary that I probably will circulate next Thursday, as is my custom, does not do justice to the many profound ideas that you have already put before us during this panel discussion today. So I would like to go on to the next paragraph on page 96 and ask Charles, if you can, to read the paragraph that begins with the words, although controversies. Are you able to do that for us, Charles?
Yes, sir.
Please.
What about the one below, the short one?
No, I want you to stop.
Okay. I got it. Just the middle one. Oh, by the way, as far as writing up a summary, we trust you.
Well, you don't have much choice, do you, sir? But in any event, I'm just trying to ask you to be patient when my summary is not, in any sense, a full representation of everything that people have said. It cannot possibly be. All right, Charles, would you please read?
Yes. Although controversies over the nature and identity of Jesus simmered among diverse communities of Christian believers during the next 250 years, these disagreements did not become prominent and important in public until the Emperor Constantine decided to sponsor and patronize institutional Christianity in the year 313's Christian era. For his part, Constantine appears to have imagined his subjects intoning some semi-magical mantra that would amount to, quote, one empire, one emperor, one God, one faith, close quote. To his chagrin, however, he rapidly discovered that many professional Christians of his day were fractious and bumptious, displaying a disarming tendency to exacerbate disagreements by hurling invective instead of seeking to develop reasonable and perhaps subtle compromises that might enable them to reach agreement on key features of Christian belief and practice. Nothing like a frustrated king.
Well, in this case, a frustrated emperor.
But I was in a little, took some liberty there.
That's fine.
Emperors only like yes, yes, sir. They don't like no, or maybe they just want yes. Do as I say.
Well, this is the moment in the history of Christianity, and if you wish, the history of the world, in which the Christian beliefs inherited from Jesus first and the apostles in general and from the apostle Paul hit the prominent public political structure of a great nation, in this case, the Roman Empire. And what Constantine obviously had in mind was one set of beliefs that he could impose or insist upon. This will lead us to the discussion of the additional material called Romanita that I circulated, and we will proceed after this paragraph directly to Romanita. But I want perhaps to spark some discussion of the idea of fractious and bumptious. In effect, these arguments were carried out in Greek. And the development of the Christian teachings up to this point, and in the Roman Empire generally, was a sub-element of Greek culture in the broad sense, at least conversational Greek that scholars today call koine. Now, I wonder whether someone knows enough about the Greek language to be able to confirm an impression that I have from talking to various fellow translators and linguists that Greek is more complicated in terms of its grammar and structure and vocabulary, capable of expressing fine differences that are very difficult to carry forward in other languages. And because it is so capable of conveying fine differences, this involves, by implication, a tremendous opportunity for argument, for hair splitting, for making fine points, and in fact, for being bumptious and fractious. Charles, do you have a view of that, given your background in education?
No, language and other languages, ancient or modern, are not my strong suit, although I appreciate such distinctions.
Does anyone wish to comment on the linguistic elements of the fractiousness and bumptiousness? I see no volunteers here. I have to say,
excuse me, Neil, you mean in terms of language or in terms of behavior in general, social behavior?
Well, I was aiming at language in the first place, but I will recognize you in just a minute because I had an intervening request by an upraised hand from Bob. Bob?
Yes, Neil, just briefly, fractious and bumptious, as I read that paragraph and went back and restudied a little bit deeper the time frame around Constantine, realized that the Roman Empire was having some trouble before Constantine was able to get himself in a position to be one of the two emperors at the time that he displayed the edict of that he published, I guess, or proclaimed the Edict of Milan. I guess it was hard to publish things in those days from how we perceive publishing. But fractious and bumptious, I think, makes a lot of sense to me, in that he was having great difficulty with that list that I was saying earlier. There was still Hellenization, and many of the non-Christian groups were displaying, fractious social behavior. And I think it was more social behavior than it was really linguistic, but I hadn't thought about the linguistic side. So that's my take on that.
Thank you. Charles, you asked to be recognized.
Yes, just briefly. This is a time when Roman civic life began to fall apart, when authority was coming into serious question. There were all kinds of insecurities that this decline in civic life generated. So the Roman civic life was practically everything. That's how they perceived and defined order, good order, for instance. And that's the main purpose of authority, was to maintain civic order. And for one reason or another, or hook or by crook, Constantine did his thing in the middle of all this. And it's no wonder it was fractious and bunches because he was speaking to a society that was beginning the gradual process of coming apart at the seams.
I sense a lack of a desire to jump in right now. No one else has asked for the floor, and therefore, I'm sorry, that stimulated a request from Marvin, which I will indeed honor. Go ahead, Marvin.
Yeah, I'll simply say the fractious and bumptious. I think, and I think you pick this up in the theme as you go forward with this, with defining who Jesus was and his nature. I think it's easy to get caught up in precise definitions, and it's simply a distraction away from the living experience of spiritual living, I think. And I think that's what they got engaged in, decades of detailed theological conversation about these nuances of the communion process and the nature of Jesus. And it was, I think, a distraction. I think it was easy to get embroiled in those kinds of controversies as a distraction from the challenges of really living the spiritual life in its fullness. That's the only point I'll make.
Marvin, I agree with you that from the spiritual perspective, understood truly in terms of the real teachings of Jesus, it was a distraction. They did not think so at the time. And the argument went on for 125 years, not just 2 decades. So we get into the point in which this theological wrangling became politically divisive and generated social and political stresses that Constantine and his successors were trying to overcome. So instead of fasting on a set of beliefs that they thought would be unifying, what they found instead was that the beliefs, or defining the beliefs, was profoundly destabilizing until they could get to the end of the process and insist on uniformity. And of course, that insistence on uniformity is diametrically opposite to what you have been advocating, a true spiritual development of the individual's relationship to God and understanding of the premises of Jesus, rather than particular theological definitions that frankly have a lot of intellectual subtlety perhaps, but may not have as much spiritual content in the proper sense. Do you wish to add something, Marvin?
Yeah, just that we are fortunately, with this revelation, because of all of this tremendous detail, not in the position of needing to engage in that kind of deliberation. They give us so much theological precision and detail about Jesus' nature and about every spiritual point in the gospel that we don't have to spend our time arguing about fine points. It's sort of well established for us. We can discuss them and share them. But I think our challenge then is, okay, what we need to focus our attention on is how to move forward in ministry and in service with these vast riches that the book has given us. And I do think that there are at least two missions flowing from this revelation. One is the simple spreading of the text itself in the next 1,000 years, in as many places as we can spread it. And that's simple. That's a simple task. It's a big task. The second task is more subtle in some ways, and that is to take its spiritual essence and evolutionarily express it in a way that ministers to the needs of hundreds of millions of our sisters and brothers who are hungry, who are never going to read this Urantia book, and yet are desperate for its spiritual treasures. And that's a second major missional objective that we should be addressing ourselves to. And we are in our infancy in addressing that second task. I think we've made a good start in the first, but we're just really beginning to think about how to do the second.
Marvin, you have once again, or shall I say yet again, played leapfrog in relation to the topic of this discussion, which has to do with comparing the true teachings of Jesus with the tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity. And so we are obliged by the nature of this discussion to go back to what actually happened in the movement of Christianity, as opposed to what we would have liked to happen. And we can hope that what we would like to happen is something that we can apply to the future in the very sense of the ideals that you've been describing. But right now, we have to discuss what actually did happen in this era of the early stages of Christianity, because that is part of our goal of comparing and contrasting. In effect, now, I'm going to make the transition to this insertion called Romanita, the separate document that I circulated. And this is the right time to do it because it follows the paragraph that Charles read. I'm certain that we will not complete Romanita today, but we can perhaps get through most, if not all, of the first page, which will be a good start. Marvin, do you have that document in front of you? You're muted at the moment, but I see your head shaking that you do not. I circulated.
No, as a matter of fact, I just pulled it up.
You do have it in front of you. All right. Well, in that event, I wonder if you would do us the pleasure of reading the first two paragraphs at the top of page 1 of Romanita.
Mm-hmm. Starting as we examined.
Yes.
As we examined the first few pages of topic 8, we analyzed the true teachings of Jesus, at least in terms of their essential characteristics. After that, we began describing what actually happened as Christianity evolved, while noting that Christian leaders and theologians made up the religion's tenets and practices as they went along. As previously stated, this is essentially what the revelators meant when they proclaimed, quote, Christianity is an extemporized religion, unquote. Thus far, we have considered this evolutionary process almost entirely from philosophic and theological perspectives. Now, however, we must turn in a different direction so that we can analyze certain organizational and structural factors that became so closely associated with the Christian tradition as to be almost indistinguishable from it.
In effect, these two paragraphs at the beginning of my essay, which is an insertion in Revelation Revealed and will subsequently be added to a new edition at some point, is to say that we are switching gears. We have been talking about spiritual principles and to some degree about theology, but now we have to talk a little bit about organizational aspects. And these organizational aspects were fastened onto Christianity because of the decision of the Emperor Constantine and his successors that ultimately caused them to make Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire. So that's what we're doing today in this section, in this paper, and we are obliged to do it because these organizational and structural changes subsequently became so closely attached to Christianity that they became almost indistinguishable from it, in the words of the end of the second paragraph. Marvin, would you be willing to go on with the next two paragraphs?
Sure.
Thank you.
When the Emperor Constantine and his successors patronized and promoted the Christian faith, eventually making it the state religion of the Roman Empire, they were not engaging in any sort of partnership, for they certainly did not regard the Bishop of Rome or any other bishop as an equal of theirs. To the contrary, Constantine and his successors treated the Christian faith as a department of the imperial government. And while they did this, they exerted organizational and administrative authority that church leaders were not free to ignore. As a result, the evolving Christian church rapidly became a Roman institution, an organization that was heavily influenced by Roman society and culture. Therefore, Christianity acquired 4 hallmarks or birthmarks that have persisted ever since.
Thank you, Marvin. I would clarify this for those who are watching us or who will watch us in the future, that this analysis and the 4 principles that follow below are my conclusions. They embody my opinions. I believe they are fully justified. I believe they do take account of the practices and patterns that were inherent in Roman society and civilization, but they nevertheless are my conclusions and my analysis. And so I will proceed now to read the 4 points that I believe encapsulize this transition of Romanness or Romanità that became attached to the Christian faith at that time. 1, authority. 2, hierarchy. 3, uniformity. And 4, explicitly defined responsibilities and roles. I would now like to invite discussion of the ideas on this page, both in regard to the paragraphs that Marvin read, but also in regard to the 4 points that I've just read myself. We will do this in greater detail later, but I think I ought to allow a preliminary discussion of the overall process which this page describes. A process of organizational and structural principles that became fastened to the Christian church, especially as it became the state religion of the Roman Empire. George, may I recognize you for whatever reactions and comments you would like to share with us?
Sure. And my thoughts on this really went along the line that these 4 characteristics are really found in every human organization, which I realize isn't the point you were trying to make. As I understand it, you're trying to point out the extremely authoritarian nature that Christianity took on at this point. But there is a precedent for this in the Christian church from its very beginning. In paper 92, section 3, Melchizedek explains why all evolutionary religions tend towards authoritarianism. It says, evolved religion commands respect because its followers believe it is the truth, all capitalized. Quote, the faith once delivered to the saints, end quote, must in theory be both final and infallible. The cult resists development because real progress is certain to modify or destroy the cult itself. Therefore, must revision always be forced upon it. The quote, the faith once delivered to the saints, is from the Epistle of Jude, which scholars believe was probably written between 67 and 80 AD. And the point of the epistle is to enjoin Christians to reject any new doctrines which differ from the, quote, final and infallible, end quote, truth delivered by the apostles. So this is how organized Christianity has survived as long as it has, because it exercised this sort of authoritarian influence over what their members must accept as the truth.
I agree with many of the elements that you've put forward, George. I think that your comment that human organizations have this premise of authority is partly because the Roman tradition extended to almost all aspects of life. The Roman practice of organization effectively was transmitted to private organizations and groups, such as corporations. The principles of authority and hierarchy certainly are inherent in private organizations that aspire to make money. They don't always make money, but they aspire to do so. So the question of whether authority came first and then the Romans picked it up, or whether we are still reacting to premises that they embodied more strenuously, is an interesting question. I'm not sure we're going to resolve it. Marvin, you want to come on now?
Yeah. Just initially, while I recognize the point that you're making from the passage you shared, George, what I think I differ with you on is and with that passage is the inevitability of that in relation to cult or culture. And I'll just share this passage from the section on nature of cultism, which is very interesting. This is 87 section 87.7 paragraph 5. In the past, truth has grown rapidly and expanded freely when the cult has been elastic, the symbolism expansile. Abundant truth and an adjustable cult. Interesting. Abundant truth and an adjustable cult have favored rapidity of social progression. A meaningless cult vitiates religion when it attempts to supplant philosophy and to enslave reason. A genuine cult grows. Now, that's a very interesting section. So it's not inevitable that cults and organizations or organized cultural efforts become rigid, authoritarian, abusive in that sense to the spiritual life of the individual. They can be creative, they can be elastic, symbolisms can be elastic and adaptive, growing truth. So I really think the stance of the book is that if we're going to be engaged in evolutionary efforts, we can't avoid these sociological realities. We have to wade into that pool, utilize them, work with them, but do so with a tremendous respect for the inviolability of the spirit and the primacy of living spiritual experience as informing our cultural efforts. So I just want to make that point. The other question I have, which would be very interesting to me, Neil, is I really appreciate the juncture that you're describing in this section on Romanita. And the question I have is, what did Christianity look like in the let's say the 50 to 100 years before this occurred? Was it less of, did it have less of those four, substantially less of those four qualities, or were those there nascently already, and Constantine simply made them more extreme and less elastic?
Marvin, I appreciate your question, and I will give you my impression. I am not a scholar who has studied that period extensively, but I do have the impression that the fractiousness and bumptiousness had to do with differing opinions, differing ideas, differing concepts, differing doctrines that were being developed and were being fostered by different groups of people in different locations within the eastern half of the Mediterranean that was then part of the Roman Empire. And so the fractiousness and bumptiousness was partly an intellectual matter, partly a matter of spiritual interpretation. And so even though each of those elements sought to impose its own view of things, more or less along the lines of the ideas that George shared with us, they were not able to conquer each other. And this was the situation of relative confusion that Constantine found when he fostered Christianity. There wasn't a Christian faith. There were many versions of the Christian faith that were being energetically advocated by different groups and differing individuals. And Constantine's view was no, he couldn't have many, he had to have one. And so now we get to the principle of authority and uniformity, which I sought to capture. Charles, would you like to jump in here?
There's a lot to all this. originally, the Roman Empire offered the potential of Christian dissemination to Christians who wanted to spread their religion. Good roads, an organized system of roads, sea lanes, the rule of law so that you could travel in relative safety, therefore law and order, and the imprimatur and power of government. And one of the reasons I think Christianity spread initially was because of the structure of the Roman Empire. But by the time of Constantine, a lot of things had changed. The Roman peace, Pax Romana, was in some disarray, and their social class system was, to a certain extent, being turned upside down. For example, many more people became landless and ended up living in cities. And large landowners were assuming more and more power. So, not that the elites were new, but different smaller groups, like the big landowners, had become powerful elites. But the society was in somewhat disarray. Christians were organized. Paul organized them in terms of bishops, councils of elders, and ministers. And they had a structure early on, probably thanks to Paul and his people. And that structure was functionally useful, at least very, very useful, perhaps even worthwhile in many ways. It gave them an organization. All groups need to be organized to function as a group. But after 350 years of this, they had expanded toward in a direction that had hints of authoritarianism. For instance, it's not a coincidence that the Bishop of Rome, each major city had a bishop. The Bishop of Rome became the dominant bishop. I think I've always thought that reflects directly upon the influence of the presence of Roman society in the Roman Empire, the imperial order. But Christianity had other kinds of overlappings. It tended to be attracted to urban life, and the Romans increasingly liked city life. During the Republic, centuries earlier, they put a lot of emphasis on farmers, particularly smaller farmers, and farming. And this was one of the great strengths of the Republic. Well, that all but disappeared by the time of Constantine. But Constantine, as I said earlier, had a society that was increasingly fraying at the edges, and they were coming closer and closer to the core. I think what must have appealed to him was the way Christians were organized and structured. He needed more structure. And to think of it as an imperial department from his point of view would make perfect sense. That would be the imperial perspective. But he respected the way that Christians were organized, and they were organized in terms of city life. And they benefited at that time not so much the educated classes as the uneducated classes, the poor, the sick, the uneducated. And so they served a purpose potentially as a pacifier. So I think these four characteristics had their own, could be cross-referenced, were cross-referenced, if you will, by Constantine. Granted, it was a stunted manner. He saw it as a I've never seen it and read it characterized as an imperial department, but that's more or less what he had in mind. Hence, he wanted uniformity. You don't have imperial departments with all kinds of people going all kinds of directions and minorities and majorities. No, you want uniformity. Life was becoming increasingly more insecure, even for the powerful. And to what extent they could see the handwriting on the wall remains to be seen. But in the 4th century, the barbarians were at the door. As early as the 5th century, in the year 410, Rome was sacked. City was sacked. At one time, the city of Rome had over 1 million people, most historians believe. By the time it was sacked, it was estimated it would be down in just tens of thousands. And grass grew in the streets. And so 100 years before, more or less when Constantine had power, I think, ironically, they looked to Christianity to help them with this problem, but of course it couldn't. But that didn't mean that Christianity didn't benefit. And these values, these characteristics, the 4 that you've listed, plus others, or at least elaborating, dovetailed rather neatly with Christianity's organizational, structural needs. Because once they elevated the Bishop of Rome or Bishop in Constantinople to power and to prestige in the Greek and the Latin-speaking worlds of the Roman Empire, or the now declining Roman Empire. It declined gradually. Christianity, in a structural sense, would benefited from it, and it did. And I see a lot of overlapping. Rome was useful for Christianity up to a point. Then Christianity didn't need it anymore.
Thank you, Charles. I have had some additional thoughts in regard to the question that Marvin asked before. And so I would like to say basically that the controversies in Christianity prior to Constantine had to do with those same issues pertaining to the nature and identity of Jesus that became the subject of the argument for the next 125 years. Whether Jesus was one person or two, whether he had one nature or two natures, whether he had one will or two wills. And in addition, there was a disciplinary question whereby in North Africa, there were certain Christians who said those priests and bishops and so on who had yielded to persecution under the reign of the previous emperor Diocletian and had offered incense to the pagan gods, or who had turned over scriptures, should be excluded from any further participation in Christianity, and that any actions of theirs on a spiritual level should be considered null and void. This argument went on for a long time, because you can imagine how disruptive that would have been to say that the preceding 20 years of actions by various priests and ministers, priests and bishops, were not going to be valid. So I'm simply giving these examples as matters of controversy that contributed to this impression of fractiousness and bumptiousness that I mentioned before. And I'm sorry that I'm going to have to abbreviate this discussion, but I must give opportunity to Bob to contribute, because all the rest of you have spoken on this subject and he has not yet had a chance.
Thanks, Neil. Wow, I do have a lot to say about this, but let me be as brief as I can, because I know we're coming up on the 2-hour mark here. First of all, I thought that this was I read the paper probably about 3 or 4 times because it had some really salient thoughts in here. And the most salient sentence in this first page here was the one Marvin read that says, to the contrary, Constantine and his successors treated the Christian faith as and then you italicize this, a department of the imperial government. That put a picture in my head. I don't know if that's a metaphor or an analogy, but it provided a contemporary picture of mine to think about our federal government. And, all these organizations that are in the government would love to be departments, because you have the ability to be able to make policy at a level that you couldn't normally do if you're in a lower part of the organization. I think we're seeing some of that here today. The rest of the sentence is interesting, but I would have said it a little bit differently, and let me just say why. And while they did this, they exerted, I would have said extended, and I think exerted is fine, but extended organizational and administrative authority that church leaders, and it says, we're not free to ignore, I would have said took advantage of. Being a department of the, at least of the US government, as I just mentioned, is a pretty important thing. Marvin, you asked the question, well, it'd be really nice to know what, happened between when Paul started to take over and preach to the Gentiles, and Peter and James went off in different directions. I was fascinated by that also as I started to think about this, because when I read the story about the Council of Nicaea, which, and I don't want to get in front of this too much, there's either 1,800 or 300 bishops showed up. And I thought to myself, well, how would even 300 bishops, I don't know what the right number is, you read different accounts, how would that many bishops already be instantiated in just 300 years? Now, I suppose that's a fairly long time, a couple hundred years or so, 300 years. But that shows that there has been some organization that had already taken place. Paul was long gone, somewhere around the end of the first century, I think is what the dates are. And all of the early apostles were gone. So to thank goodness for Google, because you can actually do some use the research of others. And I came across a very interesting about the topic of hierarchy, because I was interested in that, from a Dr. Jordan Kalev Zekov from Croatia. I mean, where is it today? It's fascinating today that we can get theses from, and great research that's very well referenced, that actually describes some of this early church. And he did a nice factual job on this. And it was formation and development of the hierarchical leadership in the New Testament and early church. And apparently, as I think both you and George and Charles said, that some of this has already existed in some form. But what I think happened, and I think, Neil, what you brought out to me about this paper, through the paper, was that the authority, hierarchy, uniformity, and the explicitly defined roles and responsibilities became instantiated, so much so that we live with these today. Only today are we seeing some of this starting to change and erode. Uber is a good example that is moving out into areas that we've hardly thought about yet today. But for 2,000 years, roughly 2,000 years, those four elements have helped us to organize the institutions, specifically the religious institution of Christianity, for sure, as this history goes forward. That's a lot to say. You forced me, Neil, to go and do an awful lot of research, but it's been some fun research, and these are very interesting things, and that's a wonderful metaphor, I suppose, that the Christian faith, or the institution that was budding at the time, became a department. Back over to you, Neil.
Thank you, Bob. I would comment that your reference to the research that you did actually being enjoyable reminds me of a discussion that you and Charles and I had before the formal discussion began about the relationship between work and fun, and that work, if properly organized, can actually be fun, be enjoyable. So I would imagine that your research was enjoyable, and we could describe it as fun, although Marvin wants to have a little bit more fun right now. Please be brief, because we are already well over 2 hours.
Well, this might be fodder for a future conversation, but with Constantine making that move, you had the establishment of the wedding together of secular or political power and religious power, yes, as a model for a national culture. And that model has continued, has persisted in Europe ever since. We have state-sponsored religions with ill effect in many respects. And it was broken, that model was broken away from in the establishment of this country and the separation of the power of church and state. And the liberation of religious endeavors from any secular authoritarian control or endorsement. And that's a really interesting area of conversation, I think.
Well, Marvin, I assume that you did read the document Romanita to the end at some point, because the pages from the middle to the end indeed talk about entanglement of church and state and the need to avoid union of church and state. We are going to go into that in considerable detail, and it is very important. Charles, I know you want to speak, but I must say goodbye to all of you. I hope you take pity on me when you read my summary. I will not be able to do justice to everyone's opinion. It has been a fascinating discussion today, and I thank you very much, gentlemen.
Well, if it's not up to speed, we'll report that to the Master Seraphim.
Okay.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
Neil.
All right.
Bye.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Adios.